everyone. Today I'll be talking about reinventing work. We'll be covering DevOps, productivity, and happiness. So, hey, I'm Nicole. I like Diet Coke, tacos, and ice cream. Let's start with the important things. I've been a software engineer, a sysadmin. I've worked in hardware performance for a little bit. Now I like to work with folks to help make software engineering better. So, what's this whole DevOps thing, right? I think the interesting thing is that it actually started out being called Agile System Administration, and it was originally started as a way to help make work better all the way through this software engineering chain. Sure, now we talk about how it, delivers value and helps improve ROI and does all these other things, but it really was this, original hipster for making work more productive and more sustainable. And it was starting back in 2007, 2006, 2009. It's been around for a minute, right? And so when we think about it, it's fairly standard now. And this really is what's possible when we fundamentally reimagine our work. We can transform so many things, right? Our teams, our work, the way we think about things, so much more. So that'll kind of be the theme of the talk today. We'll be talking through culture, reimagining how work and culture fundamentally interact. We'll be talking about tools. I mean, this is a technology conference, right? We'll be thinking about how we work and how we could reimagine that. And then we'll talk about productivity and especially rethinking our concept of work, both now and into the future. So let's get started. We'll start with technology and culture. So, by the way, changing culture in isolation isn't a thing, which I'm sure now everyone's like nodding their head or maybe rolling their eyes. But we used to think, the royal way, we used to think that you could start by just doing a culture change, that was sort of how you started. But turns out that's not right, right? That really isn't how it starts. So we found that changing tech really influences culture. So this model comes from some work done by John Shook. And again, the old model was that you change your thinking to change your behavior, right? So you change your culture, which then changes values and attitudes, which in turn changes what we actually do. Well, John Shook went and studied a bunch of this and found that there's this new model where what we can do instead is kind of flip this model around and we can change our behavior. We can change what we actually do, which then in turn can change our values and attitudes, change the way we talk, change the way we actually do things, which can then change the culture. Now, the place that John Shook did a bunch of his research and a bunch of his work was at NUMMI. So NUMMI stands for New United Motor Manufacturing, Inc. So NUMMI was actually this joint venture between Toyota and GM. But let's back up just a little bit. So the Fremont assembly plant was a GM plant. And it was actually called, now I wrote this down to make sure I got this right, the worst workforce in the automobile industry in the US, according to United Auto Workers. So if anyone has already heard this story, just tune out for a hot second. But for those who haven't, this is a really, really fascinating story. So the Fremont assembly plant was bad news, right? I mean, if United Auto Workers says it's the worst workforce, that's saying something, right? This was just bad news. Folks here drank on the job, they skipped work, they actually sabotaged cars that were coming off the plant. They would put Coke bottles in the doors so that as you open and shut the door, it would rattle. It wasn't a great place to work. It wasn't a great place to get a car from. I bet we can all guess what happened there, right? The plant closed. Well, fast forward a little bit of time, and it ended up reopening as NUMMI. This was a joint venture between, as I mentioned, Toyota and GM. And a really fascinating thing happened. And what that was that the union workers convinced Toyota to rehire the exact same workers that had just been called the worst workforce. Now, and it wasn't just a few of them, it was 85% of them. So this is a very significant portion of the workforce that had just been drinking and gambling and sabotaging all of these cars. So what happened? Well, they sent some of these workers over to Japan, to Toyota City, to learn the way that they do work. Now, what did they do? Again, they learned a new way of working. They didn't sit in classrooms. They didn't sit and take notes. They walked along the line and they learned that when something goes wrong, you rush and you fix it. You pull the and-on cord if something really goes wrong. Now, the and-on cord is something that actually stops the production line, and then people swarm, including your manager. What that is you build quality, and we may have heard this phrase, right? You don't allow cars to make it all the way to the end of the production line and then you fix things. You fix them as they go along. The other thing that's really fascinating is that then people come and they say, how can we help you with this, right? Do we need to change the angle of the wrench? Do we need to change something, up the supply chain stream? Everyone really, rallies around to fix things. Okay, so the folks that went over to Japan came back and they taught everyone else and they really kind of walked the walk. Now, what happened was that almost immediately, Numi, this plant that's the joint venture, was producing cars at the same speed and the same quality as those in Japan with higher employee satisfaction. And so again, what they found is that they changed the way that they worked. They changed the way that they communicated together. It in turn changed the culture. I think that's a really interesting and important takeaway, right? Now, some people may say, well, of course, right? Because you're working with things with your hands. You can see it. You can see what happens when you change the way you work. This can't be true for tech. And I get that, right? Tech is hard because we're working with this invisible inventory. Well, turns out much of this is also true. So Google kind of implemented and tested a bunch of this, and a bunch of this work is based on research that comes out of Harvard. So they studied what makes the perfect team, right? And originally they thought that it would actually come down to the perfect mix of skills and abilities, technical skills. Turns out it's psychological safety, right? So how can we influence the culture, and what sort of cultural attributes help influence the tech that we build? Again, far and above, it was psychological safety, and then dependability of the team, structure and clarity of the work, the meaning of the work, and the impact that that work will have. And I think this is really interesting to see because as we look through this, take a moment and reflect on your own team, your own work, and how does the culture around you impact the type of the technology that you can build? How does that change the way that you move in your space, the way you move with your team, the way you talk, the way that you can build things, the way you think about new ideas, and the types of things that you can implement? Do you feel psychologically safe with your team? Can you take risks, smart risks, strategic risks? Can you be vulnerable with your team? Can you say, I don't understand this at all. Can you help me figure this out? Or I have this maybe ridiculous idea. Can we maybe try this out? And in turn, do you feel like you can depend on your team to point out the flaws in your designs, the flaws in your thinking, the flaws in your ideas? And when you're executing a plan, do you feel like the rest of your team is going to execute on that, right? And does your team also feel like they can depend on you? When it comes down to structure and clarity, do we have clear roles? Do we have plans? Do we have goals? And I still really love 4 and 5, right? They're lower on the list, but they're still fundamentally and foundationally important. right? Is our work personally important? And do we feel like our work has impact? Again, these are all cultural pieces and cultural, bits, but they really drive our tech. They really tie our teams together, and they tie our organizations together. So I've really been talking about how culture, the way we move, the way we talk, the way we act, influences our tech and our work. But that doesn't mean it's unidirectional. It also goes the other way, right? So Western typology is a great example of this. So Western typology, if anyone's heard me talk, sorry, I love this one. This is based on the work of a sociologist named Dr. Ron Westrom. He studied this typology in high-risk, highly complex organizations, right? Dora's research pulled on this to see if it would also hold in tech, right? What he found is that this is really based on, again, how we move, how we work, how information flows in organizations. So take a look at this and see where you and your teams fall. Where does your organization fall? He identified three organizations. One is pathological or power oriented, right? Do teams here have low cooperation? Do we shoot the messenger when they bring us bad news? Do we just shirk responsibilities? Do we not bridge across teams to find solutions? Do we have failure leading to scapegoating and novelties crushed? Now, people may say, well, this is just cultural. It's not technical. One thing we can see here that could be very clearly brought out when we have bridging is discouraged, we'll see very, very highly siloed technical solutions, right? We won't have great APIs built, right? We'll have a very, very highly siloed technical solution. We'll have a repo that just doesn't talk to another repo. We won't have great searchability. Now, that could just be a technical limitation, but also if you don't need to search, why even build search? Why build APIs, right? The middle here is bureaucratic or a rule-oriented organization or rule-oriented team. Here we see modest cooperation. Messengers are neglected. If someone brings us bad news, look, I don't want to hear it. We have very narrowly defined responsibilities. Bridging may be tolerated. Here, failure leads to justice, right? And then novelty causes problems. So here, maybe this isn't a very innovation-driven culture. Now, in a generative or a performance-oriented culture, we see very high cooperation. Here we see that messengers are trained, right? So we want to surface the bad news because it's the only way we know what to fix, right? Here risks are shared because what's important here is the outcome, right? Here we see it's performance-oriented. So we particularly see this in a customer and a consumer-driven mindset, right? Because if the only thing that's important is the customer and the consumer, then we all share these risks. Bridging is encouraged. This is probably going to be very common and familiar to folks who are working in DevOps. Failure leads to inquiry. Again, if we have a failure, we want to understand why, so blameless postmortems come to mind here. And novelty is implemented, right? So if I have an idea for something that we really think could make things better, and we've weighed the risks, we want to try it out. We won't just hear things like, oh, well, that's never been done here, or, oh, that just doesn't make sense, or, well, this is how it's always been done, because it just might not be the case. Now here, Dora's research for several years found that culture is a significant predictor of performance, right? This is another example of where culture is really driving technology and technology performance, the ability to develop and deliver software and features with speed and stability. Now, here's a wonderful example that I love that kind of ties so many things together. I'm sure we're all very familiar with the Amazon shopping cart, right? So when we go, we do a checkout experience. As we're checking out, it's a shopping cart, right? Now, if we do this in real life, we see all of us, if we all go to the grocery store, we see basically the exact same checkout experience, right? We see sodas, we see candies, we see magazines, but you would see the exact same sodas and candies and magazines that I would see. The nice thing, maybe the bad thing for my wallet, is that when I check out at Amazon, I see a very curated, personalized experience because I get to see recommended items based on what's currently in my shopping cart and based on my previous shopping experience and based on what others have shopped for. So there's a great opportunity for me to notice, oh, I would probably also want to buy this. Well, Greg Linden had this wonderful idea that, we could probably offer these personalized suggestions to anyone checking out. So what he did is he coded up this prototype, this idea for these suggestions, these recommendations. And he walked into his senior vice president's office and he said, here, look at what we can do. And his SVP, I'm imagining this in my head, considered it. And he said, I like the idea. I like the idea. No, absolutely not. Greg is like, what do you mean? No, this is a great idea. And his SVP is like, it's a cool idea, but in the real world, it's highly unlikely that someone is going to get distracted and just drop their shopping cart and walk out. This doesn't happen. I mean, it might, but it's super rare. Online, people could get distracted or have a bad checkout experience and walk out. Listen, I'm going to tell you, I have been shopping lately, and these pop-ups that always want me to sign up for 10% off are driving me crazy. And I can tell you, I have left at least 3 in the last week because I can't even browse without getting this horrible pop-up. So I'm totally with the SVP right now in his assessment of we cannot risk losing shoppers. We really need this streamlined experience. This is too big of a risk. We're not going to try it. So Greg is like, okay, I hear you. I'm guessing. Definitely editorializing this. Greg walks back into his office, types up an A/B test, and pushes it into production. Okay. Remember how we just talked about this Western model where novelty is implemented? Well, Greg just went ahead and implemented this novelty at the express no of his SVP. This is where if we were in person, I would say, who here could do this at the express no of his SVP and not their SVP and not think they're going to get fired? I don't know. I don't know if I could do that, but that's what Greg did. Now, Greg did this. Hats off, Greg. Waited a few weeks and discovered that revenue in cases where there was a shopping cart had gone up 1 to 2, I would say a few percent. Now, at Amazon scale, a few percent is millions of dollars. And TLDR, that was not the short story. But now we all know that the shopping cart has recommendations, and very much to their credit, it's very streamlined, right? Because sometimes I don't notice it. Sometimes I pay attention. It's very easy to skip. So they've done a very, very good job implementing this. But it's to their credit that Greg did not get fired. They did go ahead and implement this. And Greg writes this up later in a blog post. And there's a really wonderful quote that he mentions here that I've pulled out. He says, I think building this culture is key to innovation. Notice I've started with this key. The culture is key to innovation. Creativity must flow from everywhere. Whether you are a summer intern or the CTO, any good idea must be able to seek an objective test, preferably a test that exposes the idea to real customers. Everyone must be able to experiment, learn, and iterate. Position, obedience, and tradition should hold no power. For innovation to flourish, measurement must rule. Now, I want to point out a couple things here, right? We've been talking so far about how culture can impact technology. Now, the background for this is that Amazon had an existing technology stack that allowed for this culture to flourish, that allowed for this culture to be there. Greg knew that he could code up this prototype and very easily push to production quickly. He knew that when this A/B test was in production, he could collect data very quickly and be able to detect a few percentage points difference in revenue. He also knew that if it didn't work, he could very easily, just as quickly, push a change to undo his test. Now, that culture and that technology was intertwined because technology enabled this culture that provided for this flexibility. I'm not saying you have to have this massive technology stack. Sometimes we can run small, nimble experiments. Sometimes we can do little things. But it's still wonderful that these two things kind of enabled each other, right? Because there are places I've seen where even if you're right because you dared disagree, things don't go well. So the two were still very reinforcing here, which I think is great, right? I think it's a really wonderful thing to be able to see. The other thing I really loved was that the thing that mattered most was this customer and this consumer mindset, right? It wasn't who was right. It was how do we help the customer? How do we help the consumer? How does this culture optimize for that? So let's keep that in mind. So let's ask ourselves this question. What if we could reimagine our work and our mindset to create new opportunities? What would that look like? Well, what could that look like on our team? How could we reimagine just a tiny bit of our culture to maybe change some of our tech? How could we reimagine just a little bit of our tech to enable something in our culture, to reduce some risk, to open up experimentation, to open up communication in our team or across teams? Ask yourselves that, or ask someone on your team. Okay, now let's talk about improving our tech, right? Because our tech and our culture are intertwined. Improvements that help us reduce friction, stop repeating our mindless tasks, decrease our cognitive load, all of these things are so important, right? And they're important because they help us so we can get back to doing all of the fun, cool stuff, right? Whether it's stuff we love doing, sometimes it's so that we have time to take a walk around the block and open up our brain to solve new problems, right? I love a quote that Jessie Frazell had once. She said, "My job is to automate myself out of a job as often as possible," right? Because computers can only solve things they know how to solve. Even when we're doing these amazing machine learning, artificial intelligence things, they're solving things that they've seen before. People are wonderful at solving new, novel problems, but we need the space to think about that, right? One thing I really, really love about testing and testers, and I will say, I I was a tester for a couple of years, but I probably hacked it a little bit because, listen, magical testers are a special kind of magic. Y'all know how to break systems in the most incredible ways, and you see systems in a whole other light. But sometimes we need space to think and twist a system and turn a system and look at it in another way, right? So when we think about ways that we can improve systems and add automation or remove something so we can get that space, that's the goal. Okay. So that's where I think DevOps comes in, right? Because it helps us deliver our code, reduce this friction, introduce automation, collaborate with others so that we can all reclaim some of that space, reclaim it for ourselves, reclaim it for others, gift it to someone. That's one of the things I love about DevOps. So that's why I love this. So why do we care, right? In the latest 2021 Accelerate State of DevOps report, this work was led by Dr. Dustin Smith at Google, who's leading the Dora work right now. They found that elite performers do better. So when they compare the elite performers to the low performers, they find that there are 973 times more frequent code deployments. They have over 6,500 times faster lead time from commit to deploy. They have a 3-time lower change fail rate, so there's 1/3 less failures and over 6,500 times faster time to recover from incidents. Okay. So when we think about that, what does that allow? What does that enable, right? So we just talked about that Amazon shopping cart story, right? It's how fast can you get code through your deployment system? It's how fast can we patch our systems? It's how fast can we think about infrastructure as code? It's what does that enable? Okay. That's kind of the framing that we can think about. And by the way, if you're not here, that's fine, right? What we want to do is think about where we are and what the next step in that progression is. Okay, so, but how do we do that, right? And what should we be doing to get there? I think that's often the next question, right? Like, I'm not an elite performer, or I am an elite performer, but how can I get better? Or I'm a low performer. How do I get there, right? What's our next step? So let's deep dive just in a couple areas. So I think in general, if we look at this from a principles-based approach, now in general, the main things when we look at this from a DevOps standpoint, it will be tech, it will be culture, it will be process, it will be architecture, okay? But from another meta standpoint, if we take this and twist it, right? A lot of the most impactful work will build quality in, right? Anything we can do to build quality in early will be important. Anything that we do that could be reused, right? Sometimes that'll look like automation. Sometimes that will look like documentation. Sometimes that will look like a principles-based approach to work. Anything that communicates what we're doing, right? Sometimes that's documentation. Sometimes that's code comments. Sometimes these are tests, okay? Anything that can scale. Now, that doesn't mean that manual testing is unimportant. Manual testing and exploratory testing is incredibly important. The best way to scale that work is to have as much quality, rigorous, reliable, automated testing as possible so that our manual and exploratory testing can do manual and exploratory testing and not catch the things that unit and functional testing should be catching. Okay. So maybe think about where our work can fit in here or how we can bolster and boost these types of things. Where can we build quality in earlier? Where can we find ways to help our work and others' work be reused? How can we find ways to communicate, to increase bandwidth? How can we find ways to scale? Okay, some examples. I'm going to walk through testing. I'm going to walk through cloud. Now, testing. I'm going to touch on continuous testing. Now, Dora studied this in one of the State of DevOps reports. We had covered testing for a couple of years, and we expanded it 1 year to really look at continuous testing. And what we found is that teams and organizations see much improved performance when they combine both automated and manual testing, particularly when they're done all the way through this delivery process, right? Now, this kind of combines building in quality and helping things scale, right? Now, this diagram I've included here was initially created by Brian Merrick, and it was referenced in the book Agile Testing. Now, I really like it because it's kind of broken down things that are business facing and technology facing, things that support programming and things that critique a project. And I like it because it includes lots of different types of testing, right? So we have automated testing, things like functional acceptance tests, things like unit tests. And it also includes manual testing and manual and automated testing. And it shows how they're all essential, right? They're all important for the types of work that we do, right? They all have a role. They all fit into the types of work that are super important, right? Usability testing is important. Exploratory testing is important. Non-functional acceptance tests, unit tests, functional acceptance tests. It's important to have all of these, right? Now, some folks, some teams, some organizations will have a distinct separate role just for testing. Sometimes people will wear the hat of a developer and then they'll wear a hat of a tester. There's no one right answer. The thing that is a right answer is making sure that all of the testing work that needs to be done is done. Now, there are a lot of common pitfalls for continuous testing, right? One is not having developers involved at all. One thing that we find quite often is if developers aren't involved at all, their code is very hard to test. When you write code with testing in mind, your code is much more testable, right? And your test suites can end up being broken quite often. Another common pitfall is if you're just totally missing test and QA roles. As I've mentioned before, testers and QA bring a very different perspective and sometimes an entirely different skill set, right? I've got a handful of friends that are testers and like very, very known testers and very unknown testers in the community, but they have this magical way of seeing systems and breaking things in ways that I've never even thought of, right? They know how users interact with the system. Here, I call them special breakers, right? I don't know a better way to say it. They can break anything. They can find holes in your system that, listen, if they don't find them, trust me, your users will. Users are also special breakers. And I would much rather my tester break my system than my user break my system, right? And if we don't have exploratory and usability testing, again, our users will. And it's so risky and such a bad idea to have our users be our testers. You know, another common pitfall is to not be curating and maintaining our test suites, right? Our acceptance test suites should really represent a true end-to-end user journey. That should be what it looks like. And if that user journey changes, so should our test suites. Another thing that I love calling out here is that every code change should not require a significant change in our test suite, right? That could signal a few opportunities for improvement here. Also, if test suites are super expensive to maintain, take a look at your architecture, right? Maybe there's another point there. Another point here is a wrong proportion in unit and acceptance tests. We really should be finding as many things as possible in our unit tests, right? Not in our acceptance tests. The goal here is to find as many things as possible faster and upfront. Finally, is tolerating unreliable tests. If you have the metrics available, right, check and see how many devs are just skipping failures. Because if they're just skipping failed test suites, right, is it because they're unreliable? Are they flaky? Are they just unmaintained? Take a look at that because it's a huge opportunity to improve. And also, it's just a waste of developers' time and a waste of compute and a waste of so many things. It's just really rough if we're just skipping tests all the time or if we just know that they're not great. Okay, now let's talk about cloud for a second. And I promise these are related. We're going somewhere. So cloud architecture. Cloud, we've seen, is super important for performance, even if maybe you're not in the cloud, even if you're on-prem. But for those people who are in the cloud, who here is in the cloud? Raise your hand, even if you're at home, or hold a finger up, right? Okay, are you in the cloud? Remember your answer. Okay, now, if you're in the cloud, do you have on-demand self-service? Okay, so can't put in a ServiceNow ticket, can't wait for a person to approve anything. It has to be completely self-service. It has to be on demand. Okay, now, do you have broad network access? Can access it across. Do you have resource pooling? Rapid elasticity, right? So you can scale up, you can scale down, right? Bursting like magic. And measured service. You only pay for what you use. Okay, now, according to NIST, these are the 5 characteristics of cloud architecture, okay? Now, it's really fascinating because when we asked people, we did this for a couple of years, if they were in the cloud, we then later asked them to rate how strongly they agreed with all of these. And it was on a Likert scale, right? So it's like I strongly disagree, 1 to strongly agree, 5. And it's really interesting because, for a few years, I would work with both developers sysadmins, sometimes even testers, and execs, and they would say, well, I'm in the cloud, but like I just don't see anything. I see no impact from executives or from developers. They say, well, we're in the cloud, but like nothing has changed about my job. I don't get it. Well, it's really interesting because what we found is that only 29% of respondents who said they were in the cloud were actually doing all 5 of these things. And so, it really makes you wonder, because if you're actually going to go to the cloud, you have to do the work. And it's very similar to the whole, we're going to do the DevOps. You can't just like buy the gym membership and never go to the gym. You can't say you're going to do the DevOps and not actually make the changes in tooling, in culture, in process. Okay. So in order to get the benefits of cloud architecture, we need to be doing all of these things, right? And we see that it makes a significant difference. Elite performers were 24 times more likely to have met cloud characteristics than the low performers. And this means they can ship software with more speed and more stability. Now, I promise this made a difference even if you weren't in the cloud. So what if you're not in the cloud? What if you're on-prem? What if you're somewhere else? What this means is that now that we have these five areas that were identified by NIST, and now they've been tested, we know that they're statistically, they're significantly predictive of good outcomes. We can identify these 5 and we can say, okay, even if I'm on-prem, can I make self-service? Can I have on-demand self-service? Can I help folks provision their own services? Can I enable broad network access? Can I help with resource pooling? Can I make it easy to have rapid elasticity? Maybe measured service isn't a thing. Maybe it is. I know in many high-performance computing centers, this is important, right, for HPC. So how can I enable some architectural outcomes that are important in other areas? So now, again, you may be wondering, why did I decide to talk about testing and cloud, right? Why am I talking about this now? Particularly when we're thinking about culture, especially when we want to think about the end user, right? And making things better and like reimagining this world, right? Here's why. We're all working in these distributed systems, even if we're on-prem. A distributed system is one in which the failure of a computer you didn't even know existed can render your own computer unusable. I don't know about y'all, but the last few months have definitely shown us that this is true. I love this quote from Leslie Lamport. So it made me think, how can we help make sure that our distributed systems are reliable, right? There's this really, really wonderful talk from Katie McCaffrey. It came out a few years ago, actually, but there are some incredible insights in it. And she points out that we're all building distributed systems. I'd encourage you all to check it out. You can Google the title of it. The thing that I really, really love about this talk is that she has posted the slides, the talk, and her entire reference list to GitHub. So I'll give you a second, screenshot this slide, because then you can, like I said, you can search this, the verification of a distributed system, Katie McCaffrey. So again, we're all building and testing distributed systems. So how can we help make these systems more reliable, right? How can we increase the confidence in system correctness, right? So how can we help keep these systems up? One of my favorite takeaways from this talk is this paper that she includes. The title of this paper is that simple testing can prevent most critical failures. And there are a few highlights in this. Here's what we found. In this paper, simple testing can prevent most critical failures. 3 nodes or less can reproduce 98% of failures. That's one key takeaway. Another one is that testing error handling code could have prevented 58% of catastrophic failures in these distributed systems. And another one that really stood out to me was that in 35% of catastrophic failures, look at these notes about error handling. The error handling code is just empty, or it has a log statement. In another one, the error handler aborts a cluster on just an overly general error exception. And then this third one, oh, mourn with me for just a second, because I know y'all have seen this with me. The air handler just has comments like fix me or to do. This is where testing is not only important and we want to build quality in, but we can have a notable and significant impact on these critical failures in distributed systems, right? Now, this paper and this talk came out, it was a few years ago. I want to say it was 2016 or 2017. And yet today, as I'm going through systems and I'm working with folks across the industry, I see these same errors happening. Why? Because our systems are just getting more complex and it's hard to keep up with, right? So this is where we can have huge impacts on our large, complex distributed systems with test. We have this wonderful, unique, hugely impactful role. So what if we could reimagine our technology to make our work smarter for us? And what if we could think of new ways and other ways to implement testing in ways that maybe none of us have even thought of yet? Okay, now let's talk about productivity and happiness. We've been talking about work. Well, now I tend to get a lot of questions about what does work look like and how can we be productive and what does all of this mean? Well, DevOps does improve developer well-being. A couple studies that have come out over the last few years, one that I led and one that the new team at Google led, have found that DevOps does help, right? So one from last year was that a positive team culture mitigates burnout during challenging circumstances. Teams with an inclusive generative culture were half as likely to experience burnout during the pandemic. And in the 2018 State of DevOps report, led by Dora, we found that improvements in automation and continuous delivery reduce deployment pain and burnout, right? So what's important here is improving culture, process, and automation, right? It needs to be this holistic improvement. We also find that trust and respect contribute to a strong culture. This comes from the 2021 State of Octoverse report that I led with the team at GitHub with Irina Kaliamboku. We find that teams with high trust are most likely to have a healthy collaborative culture. We find that it's twice as likely in companies and 3 times as likely in open source, right? Why? Because we need to be working across groups, right? So, and I'm sure many of us are like, well, yes, of course, high trust is important, but we continue to see this be incredibly important. So what else do we see? We find that better culture and tools can help us be more productive too. But by the way, the word productivity isn't great, right? We don't always love it. Why? Because sometimes it can feel like we're just being watched. So from here on out, if I say the word productivity and you don't like it, maybe substitute it for the word happiness. And some people don't like that either, but when I think about it, when I was a developer or an engineer or, building things, the things that made me happy were the things that made it so that I could do my job, right? If I had a better build time and a better test time and a better setup time and people just got out of my way, I was happy. And it turns out that apparently that was me being productive. So whatever word you want to use, find a replace. So, and better culture and tools can help with that. So what even is that though, right? Is it lines of code? No, we know it's not lines of code, but I'll talk about that. So what even is productivity? Well, we came out with a SPACE framework last year, and it's a more holistic way to measure productivity. And it has 5 dimensions. I had to come up with an acronym because otherwise I wouldn't remember it. 5, SPACE. S is satisfaction and well-being. It's how fulfilled, happy, and healthy you are. And it's not just personal satisfaction. It can be also satisfaction with your tools and your technologies. P is performance. It's the outcome of a process. So it's the end state. It can be the performance of your build tool. It can be the performance of the system. It's the end state of something, okay? A is activity. It's just a count. This is what we usually think of when we think of performance. So it's the count of actions or outputs. C is communication and collaboration. So this is generally how people talk and work together. This can also be how systems talk and work together, okay? E is efficiency and flow. So this is doing work with minimal delays and interruptions, okay? This will also often be things like time-based metrics. So we'll walk through a couple examples here. There's a paper about this. It's in ACMQ, also in CACM. In general, we recommend that you pull from at least 3 different dimensions so that you balance each other. Coincidentally, the DORA metrics fall into space and they cover 3 dimensions. So when I apply space to testing, here's an example, right? So if we look at satisfaction and well-being, it's how satisfied testers and or developers are with the tools available to them for testing, how satisfied they are with the test suite, how satisfied they are with test times, not the test times themselves, but you could even ask, is test time fast enough? How satisfied they are with manual testing support and visibility, okay? And some people may say, well, this doesn't matter. It does matter, right? So we can ask about that. And by the way, it can be a very good signal into other things that are happening, right? Many times you can ask people for very, very quick signal into other things that can be very difficult to measure. Now, P is performance. Again, remember, this is an outcome. So these types of measures, I didn't list them all out because it ended up being a very long list, but it would focus on testing performance and reliability, okay? So this could be test suite times, although time I actually might put into efficiency and flow, but it would be test suite performance, test suite reliability, could be test suite flakiness, okay? A is activity. Now, this, again, anything you would count falls in here. Number of issues caught by the test, number of tests run, number of tests automated, proportion of automated tests run on the delivery pipeline, number of tests that are skipped, number of bugs that are hit or miss by the test suite. Here, everything you could categorize overall and by severity. Anything that's a count falls into activity, okay? Now, communication and collaboration. So here, you could throw into it the meetings that you have, also test documentation that describes the steps to run an automated test, manual test documentation that describes the defect and the steps involved to recreate it. Because I mentioned this can also be how computers communicate, right? It could be the system calls and the APIs for tests, okay? Now, efficiency and flow. This can be how often a test suite is run before it's completed successfully, the time spent fixing acceptance test failures, interruption statistics for testers doing work, okay? So that's just one example of things that we can apply to testing to kind of understand the productivity metrics around our testing suite or our testers. Now, one application, by the way, also to kind of understand how we want to think about productivity, because again, productivity can feel like a bad word, is the Good Day Project. So this was a study led by Irini that I mentioned previously at GitHub. We wanted to help developers get quick and easy signals to help them have better days more consistently, right? Because a general question is basically like, how do I have a better day? What makes a good day? And how do I have a better day more often and more consistently and more reliably, right? Because prior research has actually shown that the best way to have good days is to manage your energy and not your time. Well, what does that look like? How do I do that? So here's how we did this. We based this on space. This was one of the first studies that we did based on space, although space is based on probably a decade or more of research. What we did here is we focused on the individual. One thing that I'm sure many folks will notice is that a lot of times we don't like productivity studies because they're almost never for us. They're usually for like managers and executives. So then it doesn't feel good. This study was specifically for ICs and developers and not for managers at all, right? And all of the reports were given only to the developers and the ICs. They were not made available to anyone else. The research team saw them so that we could like compile them and like get insights off of them to make sure they were readable, but they were not shared anywhere else. The goal of the study was to deliver quick and easy measures with actionable signal. So by actionable, we mean how could we deliver insights to the people that got the report so that they could help give themselves a better day more reliably. So these were the types of questions that we asked. Now, when we say quick and easy signal, it was a handful of questions at the end of the day. So we would ask, how was your workday, right? Was it good? Was it bad? Yes, it's purely subjective, but this report was only for them. So if it was only for you, if you thought your day was good, your opinion is the only opinion that matters. We asked, did you work with other people? We asked if your work was interrupted. We asked how many meetings you had and when you felt most productive and least productive, kind of broken into time blocks by like morning and afternoon. We also collected their GitHub commit data so we could kind of correlate and show activity and overlaps. So I will note the full survey instrument is available online. It was just a handful of questions. We also have dummy synthesized reports available online, so you can take a look at that. So here's what we found. Finding flow is key. So efficiency and flow is super important, and interruptions are really, really disruptive. So what we found is that having minimal or no interruptions gave developers an 82% chance of having a good day. Now, no interruptions probably when they're in their flow state, right? Like if you know you plan on having an interruption, it's probably fine. But if you're working and you don't have interruptions, it significantly boosted your chance of having a good day. Now, if you have interruptions throughout your day, you only had a 7% chance of having a good day. That's just rough, right? That was really, really, really tough. We also found that meetings are both awesome and terrible. And what do I mean by that? On the one hand, collaboration is super important to do work, right? Particularly when so many of us are working at home and have been for the last few years. It enables us to do work. It helps us connect with people. There are also studies showing that one-on-ones are highly correlated with coding time. So that's important. On the other hand, too many meetings are a blocker. Just that shift from 2 meetings to 3 meetings in a day reduced your chances of making progress on your goals for the day by 60%. So I think an important takeaway here, just on this slide, is what counts as a meeting, right? If it's a one-on-one with a colleague, if you're really kind of jamming out and doing design or peering, that might not log in your brain as a meeting, right? We might be collaborating, we might be whiteboarding, we might be doing like peering on something. That could be great. But sometimes, I don't know about you, but for me, some working sessions, I don't feel like they're meetings, but other things, listen, they're definitely meetings. And too many of those can tank an entire day and my ability to get work done. So think about that and see if you can protect some of your days. And I don't know about you, but me, I will block days and I will block them in hour increments so that it looks like meetings and it won't look like a 4-hour block. I mean, don't tell my people, but that's what I do. Okay. Another note, a 2-minute daily reflection can help improve our days. The way we had structured this check-in at the end of the day was it was just a handful of questions that it took on average right around 2 minutes to complete. What we found at the end of the study, we did this one more quick follow-up to see how they felt about the study in general. Developers actually really liked the quick check-in. They said that it provided them a way to reflect. It was a stop and a wrap-up at the end of the day. Another interesting thing is there was a daily gratitude study done by a handful of researchers at Microsoft who found something similar, who found that the participants in that study also liked a very quick check-in at the end of the day. So one takeaway here is that you also may enjoy having just even a quick half-page diary or a quick check-in for yourself to say, how did my day go? What were my biggest blockers? What were my biggest boosts to my day? Just also as kind of a stopper at the end of the day. So again, for any more information, including all the survey questions and example reports, you can check it out. If you can't access this link or if it's not easy to get to, you can just do a Google on Good Day Project, GitHub, and it'll show up. So I think something else that's important and interesting to think about is, what does the future of productivity and happiness and well-being look like, right? I don't know if anyone has heard of GitHub Copilot or other AI-assisted work. But now there are a lot of things that can help us do our work. And in light of that, I think it's important to sit back and rethink, what can this look like for us? So what are some questions that we can ask? How can new tools help us be more productive? What could this look like for us? I think another good question is, how can we even further reduce repeatable things in our day and focus on new work and creative work? And how can we create space for us and gift that space to others? I personally love this next question, right? What even is productivity when the measures that we've used for so long are just complete nonsense, right? Lines of code doesn't make any sense anymore. So what is productivity? How do we even want to measure it? Should we even measure it? How can we think about reducing harm in our work? How can we expand our conceptualization of who is a developer and who is a tester? And what does it mean to develop code and what does it mean to test code? I also love to think about how low-code and no-code tools can create new opportunities and new challenges, particularly when we think about testing this code and making it more maintainable long-term. And then this last one is really what even got me into research in the first place. How can we rethink well-being in terms of work and in terms of personal boundaries? So I would love to hear your thoughts about all of these. Please feel free to find me on Twitter. I love these questions. This is what I'm working on right now. So I'm at Nicole FB. So what if we could reimagine our days and how we think about productivity? So what can you reimagine today? Thank you so much for your time. I'll be around for Q&A.